I work alone at Whispering Pines Resort, deep in the mountains of Montana, where the wind never stops and the pines sound like they're whispering secrets to each other. They told me the job was simple: watch over the property, keep trespassers out, and make sure the cabin stayed in good shape during the off-season. But the first night I was here, I learned something no one warned me about. The forest doesn't sleep. After midnight, the trees lean closer to the windows, as if they're listening, and sometimes you'll hear a knock at the cabin door, 3 sharp raps, followed by silence. Pause. The rule is simple: never answer it. The last guy who did, well, they only found his boots. Slow, tense tone. I thought the stories were just old mountain folklore, until the knocking started for me. When I first arrived at Whispering Pines Resort, I thought I had landed the easiest job in the world. A temporary caretaker position in one of the most beautiful, remote places I had ever seen. The resort itself sat tucked high in the Montana mountains, surrounded on all sides by towering evergreens that swayed and whispered with every push of the wind. And I remember thinking the name, Whispering Pines, had been nothing more than clever marketing until I spent my first night there and realized the trees truly did whisper, long shivering sighs and hushed words that seemed to pass between them. The resort was closed for the winter season, which meant no guests, no busy staff, no noise beyond the constant hush of the forest and the occasional snap of ice on the lake, and my job description couldn't have been simpler: make daily rounds. Check the cabins for damage from snow, make sure the power stayed online, and report any sign of trespassers or wild animals. That was it. For a guy who had been down on his luck, recently divorced, and desperately needing the kind of paycheck that came with room and board included, I couldn't have asked for a better gig. But if I've learned anything since taking this job, it's that nothing that looks too good to be true ever really is, and Whispering Pines hides things behind its rustic log cabins and cozy stone fireplaces that I never would have believed if I hadn't seen them myself. My first day felt ordinary enough. The manager who hired me, a gaunt old man named Harris with a permanent tremor in his hands, walked me through the main lodge, gave me a set of keys that felt far heavier than they should have, and told me the basics: where the generator was, how to radio for help in case of emergency, and which cabins tended to attract troublemakers looking for a free place to crash. He didn't smile once, not even when I cracked a lame joke about how I hoped the bears paid rent like everyone else. His pale eyes flicked toward the tree line when I said it, and his voice came out rough and flat when he told me, "It's not the bears you need to worry about, son." I thought maybe he was just trying to spook the new guy, but the way his knuckles went white around the keys told me he meant every word. That night, I settled into the caretaker's quarters above the lodge. It was a small room, nothing fancy, just a twin bed, a desk, and a little window that looked out toward the lake, which was frozen over and glowing faintly blue beneath the moonlight. I should have felt safe, warm even, with the old radiators clanking to life and the smell of cedar smoke still lingering in the fireplace below, but there was a strange weight in the air I couldn't quite shake, like the lodge itself was holding its breath. The forest outside never quieted. I could hear the wind pushing through the trees, but sometimes it didn't sound like wind at all. It sounded like voices, hushed conversations I wasn't supposed to hear. Around midnight, I sat up in bed, straining to listen, and I swore I could make out my own name carried on the breeze, whispered from tree to tree until it seemed to echo against the glass of my window. Pause. I told myself I was just exhausted, maybe even imagining it. But when I looked out, I thought I saw a movement, something tall and dark standing between the pines, too still to be a shadow, too solid to be a trick of the moonlight. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and it was gone, but the feeling it left behind made my skin crawl. The following day, I tried to shake off the unease by throwing myself into work. I trudged through the snow to check each cabin, unlocking doors, peering inside to make sure no pipes had burst, no animals had gotten in, no damage from the heavy snowfall. They were all empty, cold, lifeless spaces, yet in a few of them I felt like I wasn't alone, like someone had just been there and slipped out before I entered. One cabin had muddy footprints that led across the living room floor and stopped right at the hearth as though someone had stood there warming themselves by a fire that wasn't lit. Another had the curtains pulled shut, though I distinctly remembered Harris telling me all the cabins were left open to sunlight to help with mold. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anyone, but I couldn't ignore the fact that something felt off. By evening, I was back in the lodge, drinking burnt coffee from a chipped mug, staring out at the lake as the light drained from the sky. That's when I heard it, the knocking. 3 sharp raps at the door, perfectly spaced, echoing through the hall. I froze. The manager hadn't left me with any handbook, no set of written rules, but something in my gut told me not to answer. The knocking came again, louder this time, and then it stopped altogether. I stood there in silence for what felt like hours, my heart hammering in my chest, until finally I forced myself to peek through the small glass pane in the door. Nothing, just darkness, the snow falling in lazy flakes. And yet the doormat was wet, the shape of footprints melting into the wood, as if someone, or something, had been standing there. That was the moment I realized Whispering Pines was not the peaceful mountain retreat it pretended to be. Slow, tense tone. It was a place with secrets, with rules no one bothered to explain. And if I was going to survive this job, I was going to have to learn those rules myself before it was too late. The second night was worse, not because anything outright attacked me or burst through the door, but because I had become hyper-aware of every little sound in this place. Every creak of the lodge's wooden beams, every groan of the radiator pipes, every gust of wind sneaking through the cracks, and it was impossible to separate what was ordinary from what was not. So I sat up long after I should have been asleep, listening to the forest outside, telling myself over and over that I was just spooking myself. But when the clock in the lobby below struck 12, the whispering came back louder than before, threading through the trees like a language just on the edge of recognition. And once again I could swear I heard my name, not shouted, not spoken, but breathed, as though someone stood just beneath my window calling me out into the dark. I wanted to believe it was just the wind, but when I leaned forward to look through the glass, I saw movement down by the frozen lake, a small figure crouched on the ice, tapping at it with what looked like a stick, rhythmic and deliberate tap. Tap, tap, before sliding back into the tree line like a shadow melting into other shadows. And though I wanted nothing more than to pretend I hadn't seen it, I found myself putting on boots, gripping the flashlight Harris had left me, and stepping into the brittle cold night air just to prove to myself there was nothing there. The snow crunched underfoot, the air so thin and sharp it hurt to breathe, and the silence was absolute except for the high whining moan of wind through pine needles. But the lake was empty when I reached it, the surface unbroken, smooth as glass. No figure, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all, though when I crouched and ran my gloved hand across the ice, I felt a warmth radiating from below, like heat trapped under the frozen crust, which made no sense at all given it was 20 degrees outside, and I stood there far too long, trying to convince myself I was imagining the warmth, until I heard, crunching behind me, the sound of something heavy moving between the trees. And I whipped the flashlight around just in time to catch a glimpse of a shape ducking out of sight. Tall, narrow, unnaturally quick, but when I ran toward it, stumbling through snowdrifts, there was nothing waiting but darkness and a strange smell, like wet earth and rot, hanging thick in the air, so strong it made me gag. I hurried back to the lodge after that, heart hammering, trying not to let panic take over, but when I locked the door behind me, I saw the doormat was wet again, and the footprints were there, longer, thinner than a man's, the impressions, tapering to sharp points at the toes like claws, and they led not away but toward the door, stopping inches from the threshold as though something had been standing there, waiting for me. The next morning, I told myself I had to toughen up, that caretakers in the mountains saw all kinds of weird things, wild animals, drifters, even hallucinations from isolation, and that I couldn't run to Harris with every shadow and strange smell I encountered, or I'd lose the job before the week was out. So I forced myself back into the routine, rounds to the cabins, inspection of the generator, checking the stockroom and pantry for rodents. All the little menial tasks that kept me grounded, but I couldn't shake what I had seen, couldn't erase the image of that figure crouched on the ice or the sensation of warmth beneath the frozen lake. And when I pushed open Cabin 7's door, I found something that made my stomach turn. A table set for dinner, plates arranged neatly, silverware polished, glasses half filled with melted ice water, as though a family had just gotten up and left in the middle of a meal. Except the cabins had been closed for weeks. No one had been here, No one should have touched this place. Yet the smell of cooked meat still hung in the air faintly, though there was nothing in the pots on the stove but dust and on the far wall. Carved into the wood with something sharp were words I couldn't mistake. Don't listen. I backed out quickly, shutting the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. And though I wanted to believe it had been some prank left over from a guest, the neatness of that table, the precision of the carving, made it feel less like a warning and more like a plea. By the time night came again, my nerves were shot, and I told myself I'd stay awake in the lobby, closer to the fireplace, closer to the heavy front door, instead of trying to sleep in the little upstairs room. But even there, surrounded by walls of mounted deer heads and faded lodge photographs, I couldn't escape the sense of being watched. The fire popped and hissed, shadows played across the walls, and every so often, I caught sight of movement through the big front windows, shapes pacing between the trees just beyond the edge of the floodlights, too many to be just deer or elk, and too silent to be trespassers, for their feet made no sound in the snow, their movements fluid, coordinated, deliberate. And then the knocking returned. 3 sharp raps, this time on the back door, and I knew there was no one supposed to be behind the lodge, only the steep slope that led down into the gorge, so I stayed frozen in place, staring at the wooden door, waiting for it to come again. And it did, steady, patient, almost polite, until I thought my sanity would crack if I didn't do something. But when I took one step toward it, I heard something else layered beneath the sound. Whispering. Faint, coming from the crack beneath the door, words just out of reach, but familiar. Like my ex-wife's voice calling my name in the exact way she used to when she was angry at me. And my whole body seized, my brain screaming at me to open it, to just look, just once. But I forced myself back, gripping the fireplace poker-like a weapon, and I stayed there until dawn, when the whispering finally stopped and the silence returned. When the sun came up, pale and weak through the frosted glass, I thought maybe I had endured the worst of it, that if I just ignored the sounds, ignored the knocking, ignored the strange warmth beneath the ice and the words carved into the cabins, it would all go away. But that morning I found something waiting at the bottom of the front steps, a small pile of pine needles, arranged deliberately in the shape of a human ear, complete with the inner whorls and curves, so detailed it couldn't have been an accident. And though I tried to brush it away with my boot, the needles clung together, sticky, wet, and when I lifted one finger to inspect, I realized what bound them wasn't sap, but blood. That was when it hit me that I couldn't just chalk this up to paranoia anymore. Couldn't keep pretending these were the quirks of an empty resort in the middle of nowhere. Something was trying to get my attention, something intelligent, patient, and relentless. And though I had no list of rules, no handbook to tell me how to survive, I knew instinctively there were things I must never do here. Never answer the knocking. Never trust the voices. Never step onto the lake after dark. And I knew sooner or later, whatever lived in these woods, whatever whispered in these pines, would test me, would try to break me, and that my time at Whispering Pines was only just beginning. I had lasted 3 nights by sheer instinct, ignoring the knocking, avoiding the lake, keeping to myself when the whispering grew too loud to ignore. But by the 4th day, I knew I couldn't keep stumbling blindly through whatever this place demanded of me, because the resort wasn't just empty. It was alive, watching, testing me, and every fiber of my being screamed that I was walking a line I didn't yet understand. And if I crossed it even once, it would swallow me whole. So I decided to search for answers. Anything that might explain why Harris's eyes had looked so hollow when he handed me those keys. Why he warned me not about bears, but something else. And why the cabins themselves seemed to carry memories of people who had never checked out. I started in the basement beneath the lodge, a place Harris hadn't shown me. A place I'd only discovered by accident when I noticed a trapdoor behind the supply shelves, hidden under a loose sheet of plywood. And though every instinct told me not to open it, curiosity won, and I found myself climbing down a narrow set of wooden steps into a low, damp chamber that smelled of mildew and old smoke, lit only by a single hanging bulb that buzzed faintly, and at the far end sat a rusted filing cabinet, its drawers warped with age, but one had been left half open, and inside were papers, guessed, ledgers, maps of the property, receipts from as far back as the 1940s, and tucked between them, bound in a leather cover that was cracking at the edges, was a thin notebook labeled simply Caretaker's Rules. My hands shook as I pulled it free, the leather strangely warm to the touch, as though someone had just held it. And when I opened the cover, I saw neat handwriting, careful script, a series of rules numbered 1 through 11, each written, as if meant for someone who had already seen enough to need no further explanation. But for me, each line was a riddle, a promise of danger waiting just beyond my understanding, and as I read, I realized this was the only thing standing between me and whatever lurked in the whispering pines. Rule 1. Never answer the knocking. It will come from the doors, the windows, sometimes even from beneath the floorboards, always in sets of 3. If you answer, it will take something from you, and you won't realize what until it's too late. Pause. I thought back to those nights, the pounding on the door, the whisper of my ex-wife's voice through the wood, and a chill ran through me. I had been seconds away from breaking this rule without even knowing it. Rule 2. Do not step onto the lake after sunset. The ice is not solid then, no matter how it looks. If you go out there, you won't come back, or if you do, it won't be you anymore. I remembered the figure crouched on the ice, tapping at it as though calling to something below, and I finally understood why I had felt warmth rising from beneath, why the surface had seemed so wrong. Something lived under that frozen water, and it wanted me close. Rule 3. Always leave cabin 3 locked. Even if you check it during the day and find it empty, do not open it again, especially after dark. There are things inside that only wake when the door is opened, and they do not like being disturbed. My stomach twisted as I remembered walking through the cabins, how ordinary they had seemed, how I hadn't paid attention to which was which, and the sudden dread that maybe, just maybe, I had already stepped into cabin 3 without realizing. That maybe I had already let something see me. Rule 4. If you hear your name whispered from the trees, do not answer, no matter how familiar the voice sounds. It will sound like someone you love, someone you trust, but it is not them. And if you answer, you will find yourself walking into the woods before you realize you've even stood up. This one hit too close, because I had already heard it. My ex-wife's voice at the back door, the sigh of my name in the wind. And though I hadn't answered aloud, I couldn't help but wonder if even listening too closely counted as breaking it. Rule 5. Lights out at 3:03 a.m. sharp. Do not ask why. Just make sure every lamp, bulb, and candle is extinguished, even the generator-powered floodlights outside. If any light remains on after that time, you'll notice shadows moving that don't belong to you, and they'll notice you too. My mind reeled at this. Why 3:03 exactly? What significance did that hour hold? But I didn't doubt for a second that I'd be finding out soon if I wasn't careful. Rule 6. Never leave food out overnight. Not in the lodge, not in the cabins. They are drawn to the smell, and once they taste what you've left behind, they'll begin to think of you as food. 2. I remembered the dinner table set neatly in cabin 7, glasses half filled, the smell of cooked meat lingering, and suddenly that warning carved into the wall, don't listen. Felt like part of this rule too, like the last caretaker had. Left it when the rules weren't enough anymore. Rule 7. If you see a figure on the tree line that doesn't move like an animal, do not acknowledge it. Do not look too long. Do not shine your flashlight on it. They watch to see who notices, and if you notice, they come closer. My chest tightened, thinking of the tall, narrow shape I had spotted my first night, the way it slipped between the pines with impossible speed. I had looked. I had chased it. I had broken this rule without knowing it. And maybe that was why the footprints had come all the way to my door. Rule 8. Cabin 9's fireplace must never be lit. If you find embers in it, smother them immediately. If you find ashes, scatter them outside. Fire attracts them, but only there, only in that place, and the caretaker's notes didn't explain why. I swallowed hard, recalling how the footprints in another cabin had led to the cold hearth as though something had stood there waiting for flames that never came, and I wondered what would have stepped out of the smoke if I'd struck a match. Rule 9. Do not go into the woods after midnight under any circumstance. Even if you hear cries for help, even if you see lantern light moving between the trees, especially then, it is not someone who needs saving. It is something looking for company. I thought of the figure I'd seen crouched on the lake, of the smell of rot in the trees, and realized how many lures this place already used, how many ways it had to pull you out of safety. Rule 10. The bell tower rings only once a year. If you hear it outside that time, do not stay to listen. Leave immediately, without looking back. There was a little sketch drawn beside this rule, an outline of the lodge I hadn't noticed before. And yes, high above the peaked roof was the faint shape of a tower, though I'd never seen it myself. Yet just reading the line filled me with a dread deeper than the rest, because the thought of a sound calling from the sky, something loud enough to shake the mountains, was almost worse than the whispering below. Rule 11. Do not trust the mirrors. Cover them if you can. Your reflection does not always belong to you here, and sometimes it steps away before you do. This one chilled me most of all, because the caretaker's quarters had a mirror fixed above the desk, and I thought of how often I'd sat there, staring into it, exhausted, not even considering what might be staring back, that I closed the notebook after that. The rules seared into my brain, my heart thundering as though I had just read a death sentence disguised as advice. And as much as I wanted to deny it, to tell myself it was all superstition, a leftover ghost story from caretakers before me, I couldn't. Because every single one tied directly to something I'd already experienced. Knocks at the door, warmth under the ice, voices in the trees, footprints that didn't belong, and I realized with dawning horror that I hadn't been surviving. On luck alone these past nights, I'd been walking the knife edge of disaster, breaking rules I hadn't even known existed, and somehow, by sheer stubbornness or grace, I hadn't yet paid the full price. But now that I knew the rules, I couldn't unknow them, couldn't pretend ignorance anymore, and I understood the terrible weight of what Harris's trembling hands had passed to me when he gave me those keys. I wasn't here just to watch empty cabins and keep the generator running. I was here to follow the rules, to keep Whispering Pines from swallowing me whole, to keep it contained, if that was even possible. And as I climbed back out of the basement into the dim light of late afternoon, notebook clutched against my chest, I heard the wind shift through the trees, the pines sighing louder than before, and for the first time I could swear they weren't just whispering, they were laughing. For a while after finding that notebook, I clung to the rules like a lifeline, carrying the leather-bound pages with me everywhere I went, rereading them until I could recite them in order without even looking, treating them not as superstition, but as gospel, because I understood now that the Whispering Pines wasn't just an abandoned resort. It was a place of hunger, a place that tested its keepers, a place that demanded obedience in ways most people couldn't even imagine. And if I was going to survive, I needed to obey, no matter how strange or ridiculous those rules seemed. But no matter how careful I tried to be, no matter how much I drilled them into my brain, this place had a way of pushing you into mistakes, subtle traps designed to make you slip. And when I finally did, the consequences were immediate, sharp, and unforgettable. It began innocently enough. Rule 6, about the food. I'd made a point of cleaning up after myself, sealing everything in the pantry, leaving not even a crumb in the sink, because I wasn't about to give them, whoever, or whatever they were, an invitation. But one night, after a long day of trudging through snow to reset the generator and inspecting the cabins, I left a mug of cocoa on the desk in my quarters, thinking nothing of it, just too exhausted to care. And when I woke at 3 a.m., moments before the cursed deadline of 3:03, I realized the mug was gone. Not spilled, not tipped, just gone. I sat upright, heart pounding, scanning the room, and in the faint orange glow of the dying firelight, I saw it sitting on the floor near the door, drained empty, the rim sticky with something darker than chocolate. And when I crawled out of bed to check, I found pine needles floating inside, fresh, wet, as though plucked straight from the forest and stirred into the drink. And worse than that was the sound. A slow, wet chewing coming from the hallway. Deliberate, savoring, like something had tasted what I left behind and wanted more. I covered my mouth with my hand, too terrified to breathe, praying it would go away. But then came the knocking, soft at first, almost playful, 3 raps against the door, then silence, then 3 more, and with my mind still thick from sleep, I almost stood, almost broke Rule 1, but the notebook flashed in my head, and I forced myself to stay perfectly still, though when the clock struck 3:03, I realized in my panic I had forgotten Rule 5. The light above my desk was still on. The bulb flickered once, twice, then steadied, but the shadows it cast no longer matched the objects in the room. They stretched too far, reaching like long black arms across the walls, bending against corners in ways shadows couldn't, and one of them, I swear, lifted its head and looked at me. I lunged for the lamp, twisting the switch until the bulb died, plunging me into darkness, and the shadows vanished instantly, but I heard something scrape along the ceiling above me, a claw or nail dragging across the wood before fading back into silence, leaving only my ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of my heart. I had broken 2 rules in one night, and the notebook hadn't exaggerated. The consequences were real, immediate, and merciless. The next day, I tried to convince myself I could do better, that if I paid closer attention, if I doubled down on vigilance, I could repair whatever damage I'd caused. But the resort seemed to know I was weakened now, rattled, easier to trick, and it began to push harder. That afternoon, as I made my rounds, I came across cabin 3. I hadn't paid much attention before, hadn't marked which building it was, but as soon as I saw the number nailed above the doorframe, I felt an almost magnetic pull, a curiosity. So sharp it felt less like my own thought and more like an urging, a suggestion planted in the back of my mind. The door was locked, the key cold in my hand as I checked, but the longer I stood there, the stronger the pressure grew, like something inside was aware of me, waiting, begging for me to let it out, and against every ounce of reason, I slid the key into the lock. The tumblers clicked, the door creaked open an inch, and a smell like rot and wet fur burst out, so strong it made my stomach heave. But before I could stop myself, before I could push the door shut again, I heard it, something moving inside, slow and heavy, dragging itself toward the crack, and then a hand, pale and too long, pressed against the wood from the inside. That broke whatever trance I was under, and I slammed the door shut, fumbling with the lock until it clicked again. And as I stumbled back into the snow, I heard a voice inside whisper, "Thank you." I ran all the way back to the lodge after that, notebook clutched against my chest, certain I had made a mistake too large to undo, certain that whatever I had almost freed was still in there. But now it knew me, now it knew I was weak enough to almost open the door, and the rules hadn't said what would happen if you failed one halfway. That night, the consequences grew bolder. Around midnight, the whispering from the forest swelled louder than it ever had, no longer content to slip through the trees, but pressing right against the glass of my windows. Familiar voices overlapping, my mother, my ex-wife, a childhood friend, long dead, all calling my name in tones both pleading and scolding. And though I knew Rule 4, knew I must never answer, I felt the compulsion rise sharp and unbearable, my lips parting before I could stop myself. And at the last second, I bit down on my tongue until I tasted blood just to keep from speaking, rocking back and forth in the darkness while the voices grew angrier, more desperate, until they faded with the wind. I had avoided that breach by a thread, but my defiance seemed to cost me in another way, because when I checked the downstairs lobby at dawn, I found the mounted deer heads turned. Their glassy eyes no longer stared out over the room. They were all facing the front door, as if watching, waiting, listening for the next knock. The following evening, I made the mistake of falling asleep early, exhaustion overtaking me despite my fear, and I woke to the crackling sound of fire. Panic surged in me instantly as I realized it wasn't the lodge fireplace. It was coming from one of the cabins. Throwing on my coat and boots, I rushed outside, flashlight beam cutting across the snow, smoke curling in the distance from cabin 9. My heart dropped. Rule 8 had been clear. That fireplace must never be lit. I ran, slipping on ice, lungs burning in the cold air, and when I reached the cabin, the glow of firelight pulsed from inside, flickering through the cracks around the shutters. I burst in, expecting intruders, maybe vandals, but the cabin was empty, silent, and yet the fireplace roared, flames twisting unnaturally high, almost green in places, and shapes moved within them, faces screaming, hands reaching as though pressed against glass. I grabbed the poker from beside the hearth and smothered the flames as the rule commanded, shoving snow and ashes until the fire choked itself out, and when the last ember died, the cabin fell into suffocating silence. That's when I saw them, ashes. Not wood ashes, but fine gray flakes like cremation remains, scattered across the floor in human-sized outlines, and among them a small child's shoe, half burnt, sitting upright as though waiting to be worn. I left the cabin shaking, vowing never to return, but the whole time I felt the eyes of the forest on my back, something unseen furious that I had stopped whatever ritual the fire had begun. It only spiraled from there. Every night, new tests, new temptations, and every morning, new signs that the resort was unraveling around me. The mirrors in the lodge began to shift subtly, not enough for me to catch outright, but enough that I'd notice my reflection blinking slower than I did, or turning its head a fraction of a second too late. And once, in the bathroom, I saw it. Smile even though my own mouth stayed shut, a smile that stretched too wide, teeth too sharp, before snapping back into sync as if it had never happened. I covered every reflective surface I could find with sheets and blankets, but that only seemed to anger them more. The next night, I woke to the sound of glass cracking, only to find the sheets torn down, mirrors bare, my own reflection standing perfectly still while I trembled, its chest not rising, not breathing, though mine was heaving in terror. And then came the bell. Rule 10 had chilled me most when I read it, because it spoke of something I hadn't seen, something that shouldn't even exist here. But on the seventh night, as the clock crept toward midnight, the sound shattered the silence. A single, deep toll of a bell, distant but vast, reverberating through the lodge until the walls shook and the pines outside bent in the windless air. My blood ran cold. I had no idea what day it was supposed to toll, only that the rules said it should be once a year, and this was not that time. The sound pulsed again, low and mournful, and I didn't wait to hear the third. I bolted from the lodge, notebook in hand, running through snow toward the tree lean, away from the sound, away from the tower that I now saw rising above the roof of the lodge, a spire that hadn't been there before, its silhouette black against the sky. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I stumbled until my lungs burned, until the bell's echo faded, until the whispering of the trees drowned it out. And when I finally collapsed, I realized I was standing on the edge of the lake, the ice glowing faintly with that same impossible warmth, and something beneath it knocked 3 times in perfect rhythm, waiting for me to answer. I don't know if time has any meaning left for me anymore, because by the time the lantern's dim glow bled into another dusk, I realized the days here don't follow the sun. They follow something else entirely, something older and wrong. And as I sat on the rusting bench near the spiral stairs listening to the stone breathe around me, I knew that the so-called cycle of this place was set not by the rising of light, but by the deep, unseen heartbeat of the sea itself. And tonight that heartbeat was pounding fast, too fast, like something big had woken beneath the waves, dragging the rules tighter around my throat like a noose. And I remembered rule number 7 more clearly than ever. If you hear the chain dragging on the rocks, do not look outside. Its gaze is enough to claim you, and it should have been easy to follow, except when the dragging began. It was louder than before, so loud that the tower seemed to shake with each pull, the walls vibrating as flakes of salt dust fell like powder on my shoulders, and I swore I could hear the chain not scraping rock, but wrapping around the base of the tower itself, as if whatever was out there had finally noticed me watching too long the previous nights, and now it wanted me. It wanted in. But I forced myself not to glance toward the thick glass windows, even as shadows warped across them in movements too sharp to be tricks of the flame, because the lantern hissed each time the shadows passed, spitting little tongues of green fire instead of gold, a sign that something beyond human sight was pressing against the barrier of rules I had been clinging to. And still I sat frozen, my hand gripping the little handbook of rules so tight the edge cut into my palm, because somehow I thought holding it might anchor me, as though the paper itself had power, when in truth I knew the real strength was only in obedience. But how long could obedience hold when the rules themselves seemed to bend, rewriting themselves each night? Because when I flipped through the booklet in a panic, I found words scribbled in margins that hadn't been there before, words in a crooked hand I did not recognize that read, "Soon you will be asked to choose, inside or outside, flame or tide." I wanted to scream, but I didn't, because screaming might be breaking a rule I hadn't read yet, and that was the worst thing about this place. Never knowing if silence was safety or a sentence, so I pressed my jaw shut and listened to the chain drag again and again until at last it stopped, not slowly, but with a snap like a rope pulled taut and then cut. And in the silence afterward, I realized something had changed. The sea had gone quiet, utterly quiet. No waves, no gulls, nothing. But the wind that didn't move. And then, from the base of the spiral stairs, I heard wet footsteps climbing upward, heavy and deliberate. And though the handbook never said a word about footsteps on the stairs, I knew, with a coldness blooming in my chest, that this was the moment the rules couldn't protect me anymore, that something had found the loophole between obedience and inevitability. And it was climbing toward me one step at a time that I don't know how I even found the strength to keep walking after the night I had. But somehow my legs carried me forward into the darkness, as if some unseen force was pushing me deeper into this nightmare rather than out of it. And the longer I moved through the flickering, suffocating halls, the more I realized I wasn't simply in the asylum anymore, but inside something far worse, something that wore the asylum's shape like a mask, but underneath pulsed and breathed like a living organism, the walls trembling with a damp heartbeat rhythm, the light bulbs twitching like nerves under stretched flesh, and the rules I had followed until now, those strange commandments that had kept me barely alive, they were unraveling before me, breaking apart one by one, leaving me exposed to whatever waited beyond the next turn. And I thought of quitting then and there, of slumping to the floor and letting the shadows swallow me whole. But even surrender didn't feel like an option because there was a pressure behind me, something massive and unseen breathing down my neck, nudging me forward like cattle being herded to slaughter. So I pressed on, deeper, the flashlight sputtering in my trembling hand. And with every corridor I passed, every door I brushed against, I saw remnants of lives trapped here, bloody fingernails carved into paint, childish scribbles scrawled on brick, mirrors smeared with condensation that wasn't mine, and whispers chasing me, some mocking, some pleading, some in voices that belonged to people I thought were dead, like my mother calling my name softly from the darkness. And every time I turned to see, there was nothing but the writhing shadows, moving in patterns that felt intelligent, purposeful, predatory. And when I stumbled into what used to be the main treatment wing, I froze because the stretch of hallway ahead was lined with the patients, or at least what was left of them, their hollowed faces staring at me, their jaws unhinged too far there, bodies held up by hooks that jutted from the walls, swaying gently as though a breeze ran through. But I felt no breeze, only the heavy hot air of rot, and their mouths began to move in unison, a grotesque silent chant, their tongues lolling, their eyes flickering with the same dim light bulb pulse. And I knew if I tried to pass them they'd speak, maybe scream, maybe bite. But there was no other way forward, and behind me the footsteps of the thing that hurted me were getting closer. So I braced myself and walked straight through, pretending not to notice as the first one's mouth brushed my ear, whispering my name perfectly in my own voice, the second one drooling thick strings of tar onto my shoulder, the third one hissing a promise that I'd never leave here. And the moment I cleared the line, the whole hall behind me erupted in shrieks, a choir of agony, their limbs jerking violently as if trying to rip free from the hooks to chase me. And I ran until my lungs were burning and my legs screamed. But the hall stretched too far, impossibly long, folding in on itself like some grotesque loop, until I was no longer sure if I was moving forward at all, or if the asylum was wrapping me inside it like a spider cocooning prey. And at some point, I stumbled into another chamber, massive and circular, with a pit yawning in the center that seemed bottomless. The air spilling up from it hot and wet like the breath of some subterranean beast, and along the edge were candles, dozens, hundreds, all flickering in a pattern that felt almost ritualistic, and around them stood figures in white coats, their faces blank as porcelain masks, their hands clasped together as if in prayer. And when I stepped closer, I realized the coats weren't coats at all but skin, peeled and sewn into the shape of garments. And the masks weren't masks but stretched human faces, stitched crudely to cover whatever horrors lay beneath. And one of them, taller than the rest, turned to me and beckoned silently, pointing toward the pit. And though every part of me screamed not to look, my head betrayed me and tilted down into that black hole. And what I saw will never leave me. Thousands of eyes glistening in the dark, all opening at once, fixing on me. And with that gaze came a voice in my head, calm and terrible, speaking in tones that weren't sound but vibration, saying, "Rule 11. The asylum was never a place. It is a door, and you are its key." And I staggered back, shaking, but the figures moved closer, ushering me toward the edge, chanting without tongues, their hands outstretched as if to push me in. And I knew then that every choice I had made since stepping into this cursed job had led me here. Every rule only a breadcrumb trail to this inevitable conclusion. And if I jumped, maybe it would end, but maybe it would never end. Maybe I would fall forever into those eyes, into that consuming gaze. And if I resisted, I'd be torn apart by the faceless congregation surrounding me. And in that paralyzing instant of terror, I realized something even worse than death awaited me in either choice. Transformation, the asylum remaking me into another cog in its machine, another mask, another whisper, another lure for the next unlucky soul who thought they were just working a night shift. And as they pressed closer, I screamed, not words but raw animal sound. And I turned and hurled my flashlight into the pit, plunging the chamber into near total darkness. And in that blackout I ran, shoving past the congregation, feeling their fingers scrape my flesh, tearing my skin. But I didn't stop. I didn't dare stop. Not until I was back in a hall that made no sense. Wallpaper peeling in sheets that bled underneath, doors that led only to walls, stairs that went up into ceilings, and always that heartbeat thudding louder, faster. Until I realized it wasn't the asylum's heart anymore, but mine, pounding so violently it felt like it wanted out of my chest. And maybe that was the asylum's true goal, to crack me open and harvest whatever was inside, to add my pulse to its rhythm. And as my vision swam and my ears rang, I collapsed against a wall that felt soft, too soft, like pressing into muscle, and the wall pulsed, tightening around me, pulling me in, and I screamed, but it muffled instantly, the asylum swallowing me whole, dragging me into itself. And in the suffocating dark, I felt thousands of other bodies pressed against me, writhing, whispering, each one begging for release. And then silence, total silence, except for the voice that returned in my head, soft, patient, eternal, repeating the final truth. You were never hired. You were chosen. The night had stopped feeling like night, and the dawn had stopped promising light. The world had collapsed into a timeless chasm where every rule I had broken and every shadow I had glimpsed seemed to stalk me at once. And as I pushed deeper into the corridors of that cursed highway patrol station, I realized the place had reshaped itself into a labyrinth that was never meant for human navigation. The walls no longer aligned the way memory promised. Staircases bled into ceilings. Door frames hummed with whispers like vibrating insect wings. And even the fluorescent lights that once flickered with dull monotony now pulsed in rhythm with something breathing behind them. And I knew then that this wasn't just a station, wasn't just a job, wasn't even about rules. It was about containment, and I wasn't the one doing the containing. I was the one being contained. Each step dragging me into an interior I had no way of leaving. But I couldn't stop, because stopping meant acknowledging what was moving in the periphery. The figures in dark uniforms whose faces dripped like melted wax, but whose badges still gleamed with authority, stretching their hands toward me as if eager to drag me into their ranks. And I kept repeating rule number 3 in my head. Never salute the ones you don't recognize. But the longer I avoided their gaze, the more the temptation clawed at me to just give in, just lift my hand and let them claim me, because fighting was useless. Escape was useless, and yet I pressed on. The corridors opening into rooms I had never seen before, rooms filled with patrol cars long rusted, their lights still flashing red and blue, but the sirens muted. Rooms filled with desks covered in typewriters clacking away on their own, spitting out reports that recorded my every move in real time, describing me not as the officer on duty, but as the suspect, as the intruder, as the breach. And I tore the pages apart with shaking hands only to watch the paper knit itself back together, the words more damning each time, until my own name was buried under red stamps that screamed terminated, erased, void. And then I stumbled into what I thought was the lobby, but instead it had become a morgue, the metal drawers rattling as though something inside them yearned to breathe. And when I passed the first one, it slid open just enough for me to glimpse the pale gray face inside. It was me. eyes open, lips moving soundlessly, mouthing rules I hadn't even read yet, rules that hadn't been given to me, but still applied. And I slammed the drawer shut and ran, but the hallways stretched like arteries in a monstrous body. And the deeper I went, the clearer it became that I wasn't in a station anymore. I was in the living organism of the rules themselves, a parasitic system that fed on belief and punishment. And by working the night shift, I had allowed myself to be swallowed whole. And then came the siren. Not the car siren, not the human cry of pursuit, but the world-ending bellow of something waking from beneath the foundation. And every single shadow in the station froze and turned toward me as though the sound was a command, their jaws opening wider than their skulls, their fingers stretching, until they touched the floor, and they began to march in unison toward me, chanting the rules in perfect cadence like scripture. And I understood that this was the enforcement squad, the punishment for every failure, the collectors of those who strayed. And there was nowhere left to run but down, so I stumbled into the stairwell, the steps spiraling deeper and deeper until they no longer seemed to descend but to drag, pulling me into a gravity that wasn't Earth's. And at the bottom was the dispatch room, the one I had only seen once, the one I was told never to enter unless summoned, but the door was already open, and inside the air shimmered with heat. The radios stacked on the walls buzzing with hundreds of voices overlapping, crying, laughing, screaming in languages I didn't know. And in the middle was the chair, the one every officer whispered about, the one rule number 11 hinted at but never explained. Never sit in the black chair, even if ordered, because once you do, the shift never ends. And yet the chair called to me. And behind me the collectors were pouring into the room, filling the walls, blocking the exit. And I had only two choices: resist and be torn apart, or sit and accept what the rules had always demanded. So with shaking legs I lowered myself into the black chair, and instantly the radios went silent, the lights blew out, the collectors stopped moving, and a voice unlike any I had heard filled the room, a voice so deep it rattled my bones from within, and it said simply, "You are the last patrolman. You are no longer human. You are the rule now." And my body froze, my skin hardened into something like paper, my veins filling with ink, my eyes flickering with static as my consciousness dissolved into the humming current of the radios. And I realized with horror that I was now one of the instructions whispered to the next unlucky recruit. My existence nothing more than another cruel commandment on the page, a rule meant to trap, to bind, to trick the next fool who thought a night shift was just a job. And though I tried to scream, to warn them, my voice carried only as another line in the handbook, another sentence muttered over coffee, another law impossible to follow. And my last thought before being erased completely was the sick truth I had tried to deny all along, that there was never a way out, never a dawn, never a life beyond these walls, because the station itself was the law was the hunger, and the hunger was eternal. And so now when the radios crackle at night and a young voice asks for guidance, it is my voice they hear, low and broken, whispering the one command that damns them as surely as it damned me: obey the rules or become them forever. The final hours of my existence bled into one another like ink spilling across a page too thin to hold its weight, the paper tearing beneath the pressure of inevitability. And as I stood at the edge of that ruined lighthouse, its beacon shattered, and rusted gears clanging like the bones of giants long dead, I felt the terrible weight of truth settle into me. Not the fleeting truths I had fought against in every chapter of this descent, not the lies of rules meant to protect or guide, but the absolute truth that there had never been protection, never been guidance, never been a chance. For the path had been carved long before my feet ever touched its stones, long before my hands clung to its railing, long before my lungs filled with salt air that carried the cries of voices that had never lived and yet still mourned. And I realized with a hollow clarity that the rules were not rules at all but amusements, cruel distractions pinned by something so far above comprehension that it regarded me not as a man, not as a pawn, but as a spark dancing in a storm that it itself had birthed for the pleasure of watching that spark gutter out. And the more I tried to resist, to cling to scraps of hope, the more that storm pressed down, stripping away illusions one by one until even resistance was revealed to be nothing more than another mechanism of the machine, Another cog designed to turn toward the same ending, the same abyss, the same silence that was no silence at all, but a hum that resonated with the marrow of my bones, vibrating my body into an instrument for its song. And oh, what a song it was, low and infinite, stretching beyond sound into thought, bending my perception until the very idea of self dissolved, and I could see it, not with eyes but with the totality of whatever I had once been, a vast geometry of lightless angles folding through time like a book written on 1,000 dimensions. Each line another doomed life caught in the same spiral, each chapter ending not with redemption, but with collapse. Every rule scrawled in futile ink that had always bled into the same black conclusion, and I knew then that the lighthouse was not a place, but a mouth, a wound in the fabric of existence yawning open to swallow meaning itself. And I had walked willingly into its teeth, thinking I could survive by obeying instructions carved by dead hands, thinking survival was even an option when the truth was that I had been swallowed long before I arrived, that I had been swallowed. The moment I believed I had choices, the moment I mistook fear for freedom, and as I sank deeper into that awareness, the walls of reality around me bent, not breaking but flowing, like water rushing into a whirlpool, dragging me through visions of every version of myself across all possible branches of being, each of them standing in the same tower, each of them whispering the same confession. We were always meant to lose. And as their voices folded into mine, I felt my flesh stretch, not into something more, but into something less, stretched thin until individuality tore apart like wet paper, absorbed into the hum, into the pattern, into the inevitable truth that there is no finale, no end, because endings are mercies reserved for things with meaning, and I was never more than an echo caught in a chamber of infinity, destined to repeat the same doomed howl forever. And the entity, no, the inevitability, loomed there, faceless yet intimate, for it was not separate from me, not an external god laughing at a mortal, but the marrow of my being, the architect within my veins. And as its awareness fused with mine, I understood the most terrible revelation of all. It had not come for me because it was always me, and I had been walking not toward it, but back into myself, back into the core that had birthed me as nothing more than a vessel for its hunger. And in that final shuddering recognition, the last remnants of my thought flickered, the image of a man clinging to the railing of a ruined tower, dissolving into the vast sea of angles. And there was no scream, no defiance, no light, only the hum swallowing all, a hymn older than time. And I became not a victim, not even a witness, but a note lost in the endless chorus of inevitability and the lighthouse, the rules, the salt air, the storm, the terror. None of it had ever been real at all, only shadows cast on the wall of something that does not end, something that has always been and will always be. And I, whatever I once dared to call myself, was gone, not defeated, not consumed, but irrelevant, erased. And in that erasure, the story itself collapsed, folding into nothing. And yet nothing was the point, nothing was the truth, and nothing is all that remains.